This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 686, entitled "Politicians, Wake Up! 2/3 of US young men don't even date young women!" Exclamation mark. Description. This flyer puts a rocket under the politicians to wake them up to the enormous implications of the fact that in the US 2/3 of young men don't even date young women, thus being a major cause in the crash of the birth rate, thus wiping out whole populations. To persuade young men to be fathers again, the gender laws need to be made menfair, and monoconscious feminists need to be made biconscious by teaching them and society Masculist and MGTOW ideas. Birth rate committees of experts and politicians need to put legislative pressure on YouTube to become a lot friendlier to the Masculists and MGTOWs, so that Masculist and MGTOW ideas can spread a lot faster across the planet. So people can become biconscious and push for the menfairing of the gender laws and the creation of a biconscious and FIP society. Now the flyer itself. Politicians, wake up! 2/3 of US young men don't even date young women. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In 2022, the reputable polling company Pew (PW) Research Center found that 2/3, roughly 63%, of young men in the US did not even date young women. This jaw-dropping statistic has severe consequences that initially this flyer maps out, which then moves on to suggest how politicians can address this enormous problem. I begin with the enormous consequences of this horrible statistic. Anyone with any mathematical sense can readily deduce that if this trend continues for several generations, then the US population wipes itself out, so obviously steps have to be taken to stop this happening, which is the job of the politicians who are supposed to tackle the biggest problems that face humanity. That is their job. Take the case of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, which has the lowest birth rate in the world of just under 0.8 children per woman. At this rate, South Korea will wipe itself out in only a few generations. With 2/3 of young men in the US refusing to even date women, a similar conclusion applies to the US. Some countries are so concerned about their plummeting birth rate that their national leaders devote considerable mental effort and national funding to try to solve this problem. For example, in Hungary, 5% of its GNP, gross national product, goes to funding maternity grants to motivate young women to have more babies. Similarly with Russia and many other countries. In the case of the US and with European countries, parliamentary committees need to be set up to study ways to stimulate the birth rate so that humanity can continue to have a future, which will not be the case if current birth rates continue to plummet, which are already well below replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. It's just simple math to predict that if the birth rate remains at 2/3 to 1/3 of the replacement rate, then after only a few generations, whole populations wipe themselves out. Therefore, politicians, whose top duty is to ensure the very survival of their populations, have a powerful moral duty to take strong, effective measures to ensure that the birth rate picks up to more than the replacement rate, so that we do not wipe ourselves out. These birth rate committees in the parliaments, or committees of experts, first need to understand the causes of the crash of the birth rate. This is not a trivial matter. There's a slew of factors that are lowering the birth rate. One of the big ones is the cost to a family to have children. For example, if the woman in a couple drops out of the workforce, that is, gives up her job to have a kid, then she halves the total income of the couple, which can cause havoc in paying the bills. So many couples argue that it's simply too expensive to have kids, so they choose not to. Another factor is that many women are so like their careers that they leave having 2 kids too late before they become infertile, often having only 1 kid and then getting too old to have a second due to their insufficient fertility that falls off rapidly with age as women approach the age of 35. Another factor is the result of feminist emphasis on female careerism, so that millions of women simply choose not to be mothers at all and devote their lives to being careerists, enjoying the dolce vita, in brackets, the sweet life, of luxury apartments, sports cars, annual trips overseas, etc., that such a careerist lifestyle allows. But with 2/3, in capital letters, 2/3 of young men refusing to even date women, this reality must be one of the dominating factors, given the numbers, that is causing a crash in the birth rate, that birth rate committees or panel of experts, etc., need to take into consideration in finding ways to increase the birth rate. This flyer concentrates on this man strike phenomenon and its impact on the birth rate, suggesting ways that these birth rate committees can use to stimulate the birth rate. So, if I were a member of such a committee, what would I need to know about the man strike? Common sense says that I would need to know why young men are rejecting women, and hence marriage and paternity, in such huge numbers. The obvious way to get an answer to this question is simply to ask young men, quote, "Why are you not dating young women?" There'll be many different answers, but in practice, young men are saying that the main reason they have no interest in dating young women is that these young men say that young women are undateable. What do young men mean by undateable, you may ask? Young men will reply that too many young women in the US have been so poisoned from the young man's point of view by feminist ideas that these ideas have made young women repulsive to young men, to the point that young men prefer to go their own way, living the MGTOW, MGTOW lifestyle of rejecting marriage, rejecting paternity, and spending their money on themselves, causing millions of young women to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and feeling desperately lonely, bringing millions of young women to tears, in brackets, on hundreds of TikToks, as they realize that truly they are not going to find a man, and they are definitely not going to have a baby. So, common sense then says, for these birth rate committee experts, that the question needs to be raised by them: what can society do to cause these young men to not find young women undateable and to not find young women poisoned by feminism? To monoconscious feminist politicians, in brackets, that is, for whom the only gender politics that they have ever heard of is feminism, close brackets, this very question is anathema, since as feminists they devote their lives to pursuing the betterment of women's condition. So to hear that feminism needs to be curtailed in some sense, so that millions of young men no longer see young women as undateable due to being poisoned by feminist ideas, only makes these female politicians crazy. Any curtailing of feminism goes flatly against their whole lifetime goal, their religion in a sense. It is at this point that the masculists raise their finger, pointing out to these birth rate committee experts that they should learn some masculist and MGTOW ideas so that they can be given the intellectual tools to solve the poisonous feminism problem. So, what is this masculist/MGTOW solution? Question mark. The simple answer to this question, provided by the Masculists, is that society needs to be made biconscious. What does that mean? These birth rate committee experts may ask. The Masculists will answer that these experts need to be taught masculist ideas so that they become masculisted themselves, so that they understand why so many young men reject marriage and paternity. Over the past decade or so, the Masculists and MGTOWs have developed whole gender political philosophies comparable with and as extensive as feminism that these birth rate committee experts will need to learn in order to give them the intellectual tools to approach and solve the birth rate crash problem. So masculist theorists who are well informed of masculist and MGTOW ideas need to become consultants, teachers to these birth rate committee experts, teaching them the basics of masculism and MGTOW, so that these experts can see the world through masculist and MGTOW eyes, comparable to the ways that feminist politicians see the world through feminist eyes. These experts need to be taught that the MGTOW movement is largely a rebellion by young men against the toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the feminists in the 70s, who then made them so toxic for divorcing fathers that young men look at what happened to their divorced fathers, uncles, and older male friends and decide not to marry, to reject paternity, and to spend their money on themselves, since they absolutely refuse to subject themselves to 1 chance in 4 of being butchered by a hated, feminist-dominated divorce court system that sees men as cash machines to be abused and robbed. Today's feminist-dominated divorce courts typically massacre a divorcing father in the following ways. In many Western countries, he will lose custody of his kids with a 90% probability. He will lose his house to his ex-wife so that she can raise her kids in it. He'll be forced to make payments to his children and barely be allowed to see them, maybe 2 weekends a month. He'll be forced to pay his ex-wife half of his wealth and stuff. If his ex-wife is a real fluffy, in brackets, fluffy equals a pejorative masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades, close brackets, then he may be forced by the divorce court to pay her alimony until he dies, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, brackets, FIP, F-I-P, equals a masculine term for a financially independent person who bothers to get a career-competent education in high school and college so that she can be a FIP as an adult and not expect fluffy style to parasite off the labour and money of a man for decades, thus manslaving him for decades, the worst of all gender crimes as seen by masculists, who are abolitionists, seeing manslavery as literally 1,000 times greater crime than Negro slavery, given the numbers. There are several million Negro slaves in the US in the early 1800s, and there are several billion man-slaves in the world today who need to be liberated, which is one of the fundamental political goals of the Masculists. Masculists are a lot more politically visionary than the passive, apolitical MGTOWs, whom Masculists dismiss as apolitical wimps. Masculists have a radical alternative vision for society that will go a long way in solving many of men's gender political issues. Masculists see women oppressing men far worse than vice versa, talking about the big 3 ways that women oppress men, that is, the worst 3 ways that women oppress men, namely women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being manslaves to women, working for women for decades of men's lives. Masculists are abolitionists who have a hatred of fluffies, seeing them as man-slaving, divorce-raping vermin, to be so severely punished by men, masculisted men, that these fluffy women rot on the shelf, totally rejected by men, masculisted men, not even pumped and dumped, thus forcing them to die slow, miserable deaths, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, utterly rejected by men, both socially and sexually, making these women utterly miserable. This is the end of part 1.